And joining me now is host of The Beat with Ari Melber on MS Now, Ari Melber, and MS Now senior legal reporter Lisa Rubin, Yale Law School professor and president of the Budget Lab at Yale, Natasha Sarin, and New York Times chief White House correspondent and MS Now political analyst Peter Baker. Ari, I'm going to start with you. So at first this morning, I think some people thought the chaos was over now because of this decision from the Supreme Court. But after listening to the president speak, I think it's very clear we're actually still in chaos. How much of a crisis would you say we are in at the moment?
Well, for people affected by this ruling, there's a lot of questions from what the president just said. And so it was a crisis to many that they were in this uncertainty and that the costs were being put on the American people. That's the why of how all this matters. And then you say, what actually happened? We heard from a president who lost today, big. And sounds like he knows he lost and is in attack mode because he lost. I think the ruling gives us a lot more of a roadmap, which is true both in the courts who have to interpret anything the White House tries next, but also for the wider business community, consumers, everyone out there has this very clear roadmap, 6-3 on the limits on the president's powers to try to seize tariffs from Congress. One thing we did not hear, and Lisa and I were doing the live coverage, and we hadn't mentioned this yet. One thing we hadn't hear at all from the president was, let me go down to Congress and work on something together. They have the tariff power. That's what it says in both the Constitution and the ruling. And we didn't hear that. And that, again, speaks to the president's style. He says, make America great again, but he doesn't want to do it within the great American system that the court just reinforced, which is we don't have a king, we don't have a dictator. Congress has these powers. He could do the trade agenda he has with Congress. He didn't talk about that. Instead, he talked about other roads and loopholes, and the court has a clear limit on how those roads will work. He's welcome to try other things, but the headline here is less of a crisis in the sense that a lot of these tariffs are going to be reined in.
So, Lisa, as Ari just spelled out there, the president very clearly upset, kind of in the posture of someone who knows that they have lost in that speech. But we also heard him say that two of the very justices that he put onto that Supreme Court are embarrassments to their families. When you hear the president lash out in that way, while also claiming that he has his plan for how he's going to keep much of this tariff structure in place anyway, what do you make of it?
I think it's destabilizing to American trust in the Supreme Court at a time where most Americans do not have trust in the Supreme Court. When you look at public polling, Antonia, you can see how that trust has eroded over time from Americans who already believe that this court is sort of instrumentalist and partisan. Today doesn't do much to help that at a time where we are about to go into a midterm elections, where we already see warning signs that the president is not prepared to accept results, where he is trying to eviscerate the ability of Americans to vote via mail-in ballot, where he is using his FBI and Department of Justice to seize ballots that were kept by Fulton County in an effort to relitigate the 2020 election results there. So I thought it was extraordinarily dangerous rhetoric. As for whether or not these justices are an embarrassment to their families, much less a disgrace to the nation, I thought that one of the justices here, Justice Gorsuch, really is if anything, not a disgrace to the nation, but a reminder of our separation of powers in the constitutional system that he is obligated to uphold in place. In his concurrence, he has this sort of overture, I don't know what else to call it, to the legislative process, sort of reminding people why the legislative process matters, both as an underpinning of our system, but also why, if people believe that these tariffs are the wisest policy result, that the way to do it, as Ari has said, is to go to Congress and ask them to specifically enumerate a way for the president to actually impose tariffs himself. It's not that Congress is without that power. They could delegate some of this authority to the president. What the court is finding today is that the words regulate importation, whatever they mean, they do not include the power of taxation. That is literally in a sentence what the court is deciding today. And Justice Gorsuch is basically saying, look, you might think that legislation is slow and too deliberative, but that is the bulwark of liberty for our system. Trust in the legislative process. That's as much a reminder to the polity as it is to President Trump himself.
Peter Baker, so why didn't the president, at the beginning of his term, go to Congress? He controls basically all of government right now. He could have worked with his allies in the House and in the Senate to get this done. Why didn't he do that route?
Well, a couple things, right? He does control Congress in the sense that Republicans have majorities in both the House and Senate, but they don't have big majorities, right? We've seen how dysfunctional the House is with just a handful of seats, and the Senate, of course, anything that would require a 60-vote filibuster-proof majority, is something beyond the reach of the president, it looks like these days. So the truth is he came into this term determined not to use Congress, not just on tariffs, but on almost everything. We've never seen a president that I can remember in our lifetime who came in after an election and didn't use his first year in office or back in office to try to achieve something big legislatively. This president basically hasn't done that. He had one big spending bill. And that's about it. Everything else has been done through executive power. He doesn't like the congressional process. He doesn't want to have to compromise. He doesn't want to have to deal with Democrats, certainly, but even fellow Republicans who might, have some say on whatever he wanted to get done. And he likes the idea of being able to simply do things on his own, to be able to snap his fingers. And nothing for him has been more satisfying in that way than the tariff power. He loves to be able to snap his fingers and say, okay, I'm mad at you. I'm going to put a tariff on you. Why did he put tariffs on Canada most recently? Because he was mad at a video that somebody in Canada, Premier of Ontario, had put online reminding us that Ronald Reagan didn't like tariffs. And he didn't like this president of Switzerland who got on the phone with him. So tariff, it's a kingly-like power that appeals to his sense of authoritarian power and unquestioned ability. Now, the Supreme Court has said you're not an authoritarian. You don't get to do that.
So, Natasha, we heard the president say they're effective immediately. These national security tariffs are going to stay in place. 10% global tariff. Can you help me break down what that means? What is the literal state of play right now in this country, Natasha?
Well, my colleagues and I at Yale Budget Lab are hard at work producing exactly those type of estimates, Antonia. And so basically where we started before this morning's decision is we had about $3 trillion of tariffs over the course of a decade in place. About 2/3 of them were at play in this case because they were effectuated with this IEEPA authority. What happened as a result of the Supreme Court decision is those 2/3 of tariffs went away very temporarily, because now what the president has done, and kind of what was broadly anticipated that he would do, is essentially try and replicate the existing tariffs that were at the highest level that we've seen in the last century through these other authorities. The challenge is the other authorities that he's deploying, they have more process restrictions. So, for example, to do this 10% across the board tariff, it only can be in place for 150 days before, in theory, they have to go to Congress to try to keep those in place at those levels. And so it's not really clear what the end game is likely to be here. But the reality is that if we get tariffs at levels that we had as a result of IEEPA through these other authorities, that's going to be tariff rates in the range of 20% across effective tariff rates, and about $2,000 of price increases for the average American consumer as a result of those tariffs. And also not clear based on this decision this morning, and you started to say it as you were describing in your open, Antonia, is we have about $200 billion of tariffs, about $150 billion of them that were at play in IEEPA that have already been paid in. What happens with respect to those refunds, potential refunds, is a question that the decision is fully silent on and has a whole host of consequences for importers, but also for American consumers.
Ari, why do you think the Supreme Court didn't give us the roadmap for how people are going to be paid back, what the mechanism, the function is for that? Why were they quiet on it?
Not everyone likes to do all their homework. Is part of it. Second is, in these types of cases, I mean, the court will often say, these are the lines, we don't want to get hypotheticals, you guys figure it out. In the biggest loss that Trump had last year, which was much simpler, you had a detainee, Garcia, who was apparently wrongly deported. And they said, we must facilitate his return. And initially people were concerned, well, is this a hard rule, and why isn't there a deadline, and this and that? But ultimately, the law held. I understand why there's so much concern with how often Trump and Pam Bondi are trying to break the law. I mean, that's been documented. But sometimes the court understands that a general guideline with an intention will work better than trying to sit with 9 justices in robes and actually do all the homework and do it. And in this case, it's even more complex. It involves foreign policy. It involves a lot of other things. I will mention a subsidiary point, which is they let the tariffs stand, which was kind of a nice gesture to Donald Trump, even though he was on his way to a loss. He lost in the lower courts. So these things operate for that long as a way of giving him what we might call, and I'm simplifying, benefit of the doubt. In the end, he still lost. Now they say no. The question you ask is important and insightful, because there are many people who would say they were too nice to begin with because of the reasons you just mentioned. They should have paused this up front because it was likely to lose. It had lost in the lower courts. And so this is an area where, on the one hand, we are in different times. When the president is calling the names we heard today, when he's asking for opponents and journalists to be indicted in cases that continuously come up short, we're in different times. The court sometimes, though, is still operating like old times and saying, you get the benefit of the doubt. Critics would say that let him run roughshod now for 13 months or so. I guess a little less. He's been in for 13 months. 10 months. Experts. 10 months running roughshod with tariffs because he benefited from the time. But that's the short answer to sum up everything I'm just saying. They were being nice. They were being conservative. But ultimately they said, no, you don't have that power.